So core and cluster policies are so important, and we think about child protection, especially when we think about Aboriginal families. We know that people who work as staff are mandatory reporters, so it's really important that we've got a very solid child protection policy, that are steps in place to protect Aboriginal families who are more at risk, and that everybody through induction, and that policy around induction is very clear on what that looks like. It creates an accountability. Another really important policy is to have a really clear and strong Aboriginal healing framework that underpins every single aspect of a core and cluster service delivery.
Access, equity and safety policies must be underpinned by a human rights framework within services, and that's particularly important for migrant and refugee women, so that their permanency status or lack thereof doesn't impact their access to safety. It's really important that core and cluster services utilise the good practice guidelines in supporting migrant and refugee women, because they do act as a great minimum standard in making sure that the first response that they receive is actually the best response. And that builds confidence in accessing services and the professionalism of the sector. It's also really important that core and cluster services do ensure that within their timeframes and within their caseworkers, there is adequate access to telephone and interpreter services, and a deep listening that also comes along with that level of engagement. It's also important that there is improved intake and assessment processes, which don't just support women in navigating the formal state-based processes, but actually keep within view the community-based processes that women navigate and experience, including what faith and community leaders they might engage with in trying to resolve domestic and family violence or family conflict, parenting, custody, and a whole range of other issues.
Really important to have appropriate policies in a core and cluster model, policies that address safety, good policies around risk assessment, policies around safety for staff and clients, policies that look at cultural diversity. Things like a reconciliation action plan are always really positive, that give that message to First Nations people, how we want to work with them and that we're committed to their healing. We need policies around access to make sure the services are available to everybody, policies around the use of interpreters.
Women with disability may be excluded from services if the service doesn't recognise that the particular kinds of domestic and family violence that women with disability experience are nuanced and unique to women with disability. So to be inclusive of women with disability, a services policy should address these forms of domestic and family violence and the ways in which gender and disability discrimination intersect. Cross-sector collaboration between domestic and family violence and disability specialists and services, peak bodies, is all vital in this process. So some of the things that an organisation can address via policy to remove these additional barriers experienced by women with disability are things like creating fully accessible spaces in all areas for clients, but also for staff, and having women with disability on staff. So having an inclusive employment policy, consider employing a specialist disability worker, having a disability inclusion action plan to cover all of these areas and look at all of the approaches in which your organisation can be more inclusive.
If your intake processes and forms consider our communities and ask questions about our communities, and that the staff are trained regularly to make sure that they understand our communities, but also know how to ask questions around gender, sexuality for our communities as well. It's also important to think about what the policy setting looks like within the organisation. Is there an inclusive practice policy? Is there a non-discrimination or anti-discrimination policy that really makes clear who is welcome and why? And what happens if they don't feel welcome? What happens if somebody experiences homophobia or transphobia within a service? How will that be addressed? And making clear that that's just not acceptable either. It's important to recognise and really understand that trans women are experiencing violence in their homes, on the street, at work and in public every day. That the person who is most likely to be at risk is a trans woman. The person who is most likely to be and feel unsafe in a public space, in a bathroom, accessing services, is a trans woman. And in particular, trans women living across those intersections. There are a range of organisations, resources that are available to help. I would always recommend Say It Out Loud, the website First Up, as an amazing resource. And I'd also recommend Trans Hub for people that want to learn more about the trans experience and how to be a great ally, but also for health providers. I'd recommend services like the Gender Centre, Inner City Legal Centre, 2010, Rainbow Families. There's a range of organisations that exist for our communities and are led by our communities. And it's always good to know who they are and where they are.